Perfect. Well, thank you, everyone. This is our fifth committee meeting. We can kind of walk through our agenda for tonight. I have a separate agenda as well, but I'll just use this one for right now. We are going to walk through the Good Neighbor Agreement. Again, this is a draft. These are all draft documents. None of these are final. They're just intended for comments and feedback from the committee. We're also going to walk through a separate resident owner agreement. A lot of owner operator folks of transitional housing, supportive housing, will have these agreements themselves. This is really intended, I would think, for anybody who doesn't, and also for really small developments. If we're thinking about just a couple of units where they may not be a bigger operator, a bigger provider, they may not have these agreements in place. And so this is an example that the city can share of something that they could then modify. And then we'll walk through our proposed code updates and definitions. We'll kind of walk through the things that we need to incorporate in. A lot of them are definition changes, those types of things. Some of the things that we recommend incorporating in, and then some other items that are really, they're things that are in other codes. We are not necessarily recommending that they go in, but we want to make sure you have the information to be able to tell us what your decision is one way or another, or your recommendation is one way or another on them. And so when we get to them, we'll kind of walk through each of them. And then I also added a little section about some of the things we also considered, but ultimately didn't include for recommendations, and we'll talk about that as well. So, and then lastly, we'll finish with sort of the open house materials and prep for that, and see, kind of walk through that portion as well. So on these for the Good Neighbor Agreement, this is the agreement between, it would be the city, a development operator, and then appropriate local parties. A lot of times this is going to be neighboring businesses if there are neighborhood associations adjacent, other folks who are going to benefit from having a good neighbor agreement with whoever the operator is of the facility. It's going to define the geographic area and that this agreement applies to. The sample we had defines roles and responsibilities for all parties and identifies primary points of contacts, and then describes communication methods, and then maybe an escalation process for how to address different concerns. So really, it's intended to be a beneficial document for all parties involved. The groups who are residing at a step housing or transitional supportive housing, permanent supportive housing project, get assurances that they will not be harassed, they will not be they will not be unfairly targeted or anything like that. And then local businesses will have a process by which to address any concerns they might have that is not directly going to and trying to directly go to a resident or anything like that to try and solve concerns. So the process is a little bit more outlined in the actual document. It goes through a few different things. The next slide has a little bit of what those components are. But I think one of the things early on we wanted to identify is right now we are proposing to have this be strongly recommended, but not a requirement, just because potentially two things. Commerce guidance recommends you do not make it a requirement. It could be another level of something in terms of a requirement or a burden that could someone could try and take advantage of, right? If a neighboring property or somebody really didn't like the development, they could say, well, I'm not going to enter into this agreement, and since you don't have this agreement, you're required to have it. So requiring it is really a tough thing to do, but strongly recommending, again, because it's a beneficial document for everybody involved, is the proposal that we made. But it would just, the difference being the code would not require that this be in place. On some of these different parties, so on the operator side, again, these are all draft. They can be modified by all parties. I think the assumption is that they likely would be modified in little places, just depending on what the specific requirements are for these different types of housing developments. But for the operator, provide 24/7 staff and security, develop and enforce rules in the operator resident agreement, work with the city to perform informational outreach, and then keep grounds clean and presentable. For the neighboring parties, contact only the appropriate personnel with concerns, really trying to avoid people just going straight to residents if they have a particular concern. Respect the rights of step residents, be provided with contact information of operator staff, and then not attempt to handle violations without contacting appropriate personnel. And then on both sides, recommended is a 90-day check-in to see how things are going, maybe periodic check-ins after that, answer questions about the development and agreement from interested parties, and then resolve concerns quickly, diplomatically, and follow procedure. So the actual agreement has some of these in a little bit more detail, but these are the kind of high level in our research and going through and looking at these different good neighbor agreements, the items that are pretty not only standard but pretty important to have in the document. So I'll stop there for a second and just if there's any comments on this, if there's anything you maybe expected to see in the good neighbor agreement that you don't see, and we're happy to take those and go take a look at them right now or after this call.
I had a quick question
Yeah,
just for my own like knowledge and understanding. For the operator, is it standard in all types of step housing to have 24/7 staff and security, or is that something that there's a reason why some type of step might not have staff 24 hours a day or security? I mean, it seems, I mean, especially with a smaller facility, like maybe you
yeah.
wouldn't have 24/7 security. So can you help me understand if that's something that we just have as a feature of every step housing development, or if that's
I think
a
you make
feature?
a really good point when it comes to smaller developments. I think for larger ones, because there are a lot of times established primary points of entries that are locked and need someone to open them to see who's coming in. And so those types of procedures, there typically is 24/7 staff at a counter. But I do agree that's probably overly burdensome on a smaller development that just has a couple of units. So we'll take a look at that and maybe see if that's something to tweak or try and modify the language to where it's not. Because I agree that that's not something that's probably likely feasible. Okay,
I
that's you.
wanted to jump in. I had the same thought as Kat. I know in the panelists we had talked about, sometimes you have these small specialist,
Yeah,
units and versus like the really big spaces that feel like, assisted living. Um, so I'm glad she already brought that up. And then also, I'm glad you brought this up, Nick, about the required or recommended, not required. When I was reviewing this, I was like, oh my goodness, if all of the businesses and neighbors need to pass off on these, that can set up a community for not getting anything passed if you have one business that is just
yeah.
all, or one community corner of the space that is always just going to say no and say, no, I want nothing downtown. I want nothing downtown if they are big enough to be the neighbors of everybody. So, of course, we want to assume the best and we want to assume that we win everybody over. But I do think that that's a very real reality that, sometimes you're not going to win everybody over. Um, and, there's a fine line of trying to, you don't want to set up housing and space and invite vulnerable neighbors into a place where they're not safe, but also you know, sometimes your
Yeah.
local grocer is grumpy and you need to build something anyway. So
Oh, and I think,
I'm glad you brought that up.
yeah, no, thank you. And I think, right, sometimes we have to just default back to the law that says there are certain areas where the law is designated you need to allow these developments, and so we're going to allow these developments there. And if someone doesn't want it, like they're welcome to come out and voice their opinion during some of the public processes. But ultimately, we don't want to put a step in here that's going to uh, create an overly burdensome step that ultimately could be a way to kind of like fight or go against these types of developments. That again is not a recommendation of commerce. It's not something that many cities do in terms of making requirements of it.
We don't want to inadvertently create like a loophole for people to veto
Right.
something.
What if it's just a requirement that the good neighbor agreement is delivered? I mean, again, totally different
Without,
scenario.
yeah.
Mm.
But we have that for short-term rentals in Port Angeles, where we have to deliver a good neighbor agreement to like each neighboring and facing property within, I mean, ours is just like three neighbors, right? So
Hmm.
this, I imagine, would be a bigger net that you'd cast, but it's like where we don't even like, just don't even put a line for the neighbors to sign off on it. Just be like, here, this is what we're doing. Here's what you do if you have any what we're doing. Um, but if we require it on any level or to be returned, I think that I mean, I think there's a very valid concern that that can complicate and block these developments. But I think if we just say it has to be delivered to all properties or all owners within this area, then you can do the same thing every time. You don't have to worry about somebody causing trouble as long as it's delivered.
Yeah, we did think about that, about putting initially the requirement read something along the lines of you must make an attempt or something like that. I think show you made an attempt or something like that. That's certainly something we could do is you could develop a standard agreement and then have it be just something that gets delivered. Um, I would want to, I don't know, part of me, I guess it's not that different from making the recommendation. Part of me sees a scenario where someone just goes, well, I didn't get it. Like I wanted to, so, right, having some ability to say like, yes, they did receive it. But again, if it's not a requirement that they receive it, then ultimately you remove that as well. But I think that's definitely, it is along the same line of thought that we went down the first thing as well, is like we wanted to have this in place or at least have them aware of it without it putting an impediment in. So, well, how about we think about some language about just whether that could work in terms of the delivery process. I think that's a good thing to think about a little bit. So we'll come back with a recommendation on that. Okay. Cool. So this resident operator agreement, I think as I mentioned, most of the larger operators are going to have their own agreement, right? The folks that we met with for the panel, they all have their own agreements. The one that we sent as a draft is intended to be a sample that can be modified. It has a lot of the same characteristics of the sample agreements that we had as well. But we thought it's helpful for the city to provide something to somebody who maybe is a smaller operator who doesn't have these types of agreement in place, but wants something. If anything, it's a resource that could be handed out. So it just talks about activity rules for residents and limiting noise, pets, guests to whatever extent they want. For each development, that's going to be different. They're going to approach how they handle guests differently, right? If you have a separated single entry area versus small development where it might be harder to have a one secured entry area when you don't have 24/7 staff or something like that. It's just going to need to get modified as is necessary for those developments. But prohibiting littering, drug use and sales, panhandling, other public nuisance and illegal acts. And then knowing that this is just an operator agreement, doesn't supersede any of the local requirements or local ordinances that the city has in place. Similar to the previous agreement, it defines a geographic area. And then as I mentioned, it's a sample agreement. So this is a much shorter agreement than the other one. And really this is between residents and the operators. So any questions on this agreement as it was presented? Okay, looks like we might have lost Kat. I think she might join here. Hopefully join back in a second. Okay, so not seeing anything there. That one was a pretty straightforward one. Honestly, it wasn't. There's not too much in that one. Wanted to talk a little bit about the proposed code updates that were in the document that we sent over. We looked at a couple different definitions that we felt was important to add. One, defining what a good neighbor agreement is in the code, and then permanent supportive housing, transitional housing. Oh, perfect. Okay.
Sorry
Lost
about
you
that.
for a second. No,
No,
you're good.
the computer died, so I
Did
had to
you?
find a cord.
All good. Did you have any questions, comments on the resident operator agreement portion?
I don't think so.
Okay, this one's pretty straightforward in terms of it's pretty modifiable. There's nothing, it's not a requirement. It's something that the city, the operator would put in place, and almost all of them do. So
Yeah, no, that one was straightforward.
okay. And then Tim, I know you're on as well. On video, so I can't see you, but if you have any questions or comments, just let me know.
No worries. Now that I figured out how to use my phone on Zoom, sorry. The only thing I was going to throw out is should we include the word neighbors as opposed to just businesses surrounding the area?
Oh, on the previous agreement?
Yes, sorry, I'm one back.
Yep. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I think in the language, we'll double check the language. It's in the sample we sent over, but I think it does have, we have neighboring associations, businesses. I think we can add, just neighbors in terms of residents as well in there. We will
Thank you.
double check that that's in there. Okay, so on some of the code updates, this is the portion where we kind of talk through some of the recommended changes that we want to make that we think are more or less a little bit more boilerplate in terms of definitions to be added. So good neighbor agreement, permanent supportive housing, and then transitional housing, emergency shelters, emergency housing, the term temporary, and then step housing. A lot of these definitions are either following state guidance or they're following other jurisdictions, but if there are certain tweaks to them that you want to see, we can do that as well. And I'm happy to drag the document over onto my other screen, and you can take a look at the actual definitions if you have like language tweaks, or you can just, I think we sent a Word doc, so you could make red line edits and send them over for consideration as well. But all these definitions are fairly straightforward, and we also did work with development services to go through the definitions to make sure that they're in line with some of the other definitions that the city has and just the way that they generally word things. So those are pretty straightforward. In terms of definition or edits to the actual code, we are required to, so now that we have these different housing types, we're required to add them as permitted uses within the zones where they need to be permitted. And so I think we've shown a map in the past, and we've got all the zones listed in the memo and in here as well. It's a good portion of the city after you map it up. So we'll add those as permitted uses just within the code. Emergency shelters is really all zones where hotels are permitted. And then, well, I'll stop there for a second because Juliana, you got your hand up.
I didn't mean to cut you off. I just thought of something since our last everything. I recognize a lot of this is a lot of our city. One thing I would love in my ideal Kenmore step housing zone is, and maybe some of this is redundant, is I would love it to be as easy as possible for our spaces of worship to develop step housing on their property. And, I was part of a nonprofit in California that, their congregation was getting smaller, but their property was quite large. And so when they did a remodel, they literally built PSH housing on part of their property. They still had their sanctuary, but then they built PSH housing. And but that took a lot of work with the city to figure out some of the zoning and some of the things. And I just think if there's any, there's so many creative ways to do housing, and there's so many. I personally love it when our faith communities are really actively involved in housing our neighbors. And so I don't know if we could add that language, like any spaces where I think that some of this is already like built in, but any zones where there's spaces of worship can also do
I think
I think that some of this is like on top of each other, but I don't know. I don't know if there's examples from other cities. I tried to Google it.
There is some overlap because a lot of those uses are in residential zones, just because basically like you can build churches in pretty much
anywhere,
any zone. Yeah, they're, because of a lot of religious freedoms, they're allowed in a lot of different areas. So
but I don't know. This is where it got nitty gritty for me about and I know that again, some things are just different when you're like religiously zoned, but like parking requirements and just all of that. Part of me is just like, I'm not familiar with how that works, but I just want it to be very, very easy and streamlined for our spaces of worship to be able to, if they want to do something on their land, I want the city Kenmore zoning to have fewest barriers as possible.
Okay. I know.
So if someone could help look into how we could make that happen.
We can definitely look into it. Debbie, the materials you sent me, the draft materials on indoor and outdoor temporary homeless shelters. I think it does specify places of worship in the language. I need to go back and double check what Sam
Yeah.
sent over
Yeah, I know
in terms
for
of the draft
temporary
language.
that is, but
Yeah,
I'm just
so
thinking of like,
right. So like
we have a
along
lot of
those same,
options.
yeah, those same lines of thought of like if we can specify it for one, I wonder going down that path if we're able to specify it for, because I do think it's a lot of overlap, like you said, with the areas that are already allowing it. Um, but I'm trying to think. There's some specific laws that relate to the kind of temporary homeless shelters with those use spaces that don't necessarily exist for permanent supportive and transitional housing. But that's not to say that the city, if the committee wanted to make the recommendation, the city couldn't consider those things.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. Is there a parking reduction tool for step housing, or does parking requirement fall under whatever is typical for that zone?
It could go one of two ways. So the
There's
last
not
two
really.
bullet, yeah, the last two bullet points here are variance process through a type 2 decision process. We could propose that someone could modify the parking requirement through a variance, or we could just set aside a separate, maybe more streamlined process for a parking modification plan that just says director approval, uh, along with the rest of your application. Here's how we plan to modify parking, and kind of like we talked about previously, maybe it's you offset it with a shuttle that provide, once a week takes residents to certain services or things like that. That's what would be outlined in the plan. So if that's something the committee wanted to look at, this parking modification plan, we would um, go through and try and draft out some of the basic tenets of what that parking modification plan would include.
My preference would be to see an outright like parking reduction calculation in the code so that it isn't something. I mean, I'd like there to be as little subjectivity in there as possible, where somebody could just read it and be like, oh, okay, we can build this and we need 4 parking spots rather than 25 or something, whatever it is. If
Mm-hmm.
there's, because I think one of the things that we heard from the panelists is that it sounds like the requirement for parking for step housing is going to be in a lot of cases substantially lower than it would be for another type of housing development. So if we're able to just build that into the code, like this particular type of housing is unlikely to require the amount of parking that would be required under or for a different type of development, then I think that just makes it easier on everybody.
Okay. We can look for examples of what maybe jurisdictions have done or try and draft some language.
I second everything Kat said.
Perfect.
Okay.
And I'm going to jump in. Hopefully, I'm not in the minority, but it felt like I know I, for one, am against too much reduction in parking. I feel that's way too much of a burden on neighboring communities. But with the limited number of people we have here today, I feel like maybe that's something we could chat about next time we have a bigger group together, of what we all agree on to be a reduction or to be, like you said, maybe specific steps on how much we can reduce parking.
Yeah, I think we can certainly bring forward both approaches, maybe like a parking modification plan approach, and then a slightly more, well, not slightly, but as far as we can take it, a more objective approach that just outlines specific standards. I just haven't seen that done. It's certainly possible, right? You can write the code language that way. I haven't seen it done, so I would want to take a look and see um, what's worked in the past potentially in some jurisdictions or what's currently being at least utilized in some jurisdictions. So we'll take that note to bring both forward. And then when we do have, we might end up sending it out over email just so we don't lose a bunch of time. But we can certainly, I do want to get feedback from the larger group.
Yeah. And I don't want to discount Tim's concerns about that, sometimes we
Yeah.
can all, I think all of us maybe have experienced the surprise of, who is in my driveway or who's in front of my house, or maybe where do they come from? Are they my neighbor? I just also recognize that parking, when you were building housing, like each parking space is usually many tens of thousands of dollars to build. And so when we were already building housing that requires so many subsidies, that calculation to be very, very thoughtful. And I just expect the developer to be coming to those calculations with so much care. And I just also, I don't know, I want them to be able to, I'm going to expect that our step housing tenants, which are very likely going to be disabled or older adults or somehow, fall into a vulnerable category. I think it is likely that they are not going to be driving or owning cars as typically as other developments. And I think I just also want a narrative piece that speaks to that because I think that, you know, in the same way that if it wasn't a step housing development, anytime there's a very large development that comes to my neighborhood, I'm going to wonder how is this going to impact me, right? How is this going to impact traffic? How is this going to impact noise? How is this going to impact, sign pollution? I think anytime we have a very large development, all of the neighbors are going to wonder about the impact. So, whether it's parking or noise or partying or something else, I think all of us are going to wonder, like, how is this going to shift things?
Mhm.
So I think that I don't know, I think that we all want a lot of the same things, right? I don't think we don't want housing to be built because parking is so expensive. And we don't want parking. I don't think we don't I'm speaking, maybe I'm making assumptions. I don't think we want housing to not be built because something is poorly designed. But I also don't think that we all want to get angry at a project, you know,
Yeah,
because we miscalculated impact. So
yeah.
thoughtfulness will hopefully lead us all.
I think going back a little bit to the conversation we had at the last meeting of just trying to introduce ways to create flexibility
Yeah.
versus um, having really, really strict requirements that need to be met is a generally good approach. I Patty, you hear what you're saying about making sure there's not as much subjectivity in that, but I think introducing ways to have flexibility is helpful. And that way, my having worked with a good number of developers as well, my feeling has always been they will build the amount of parking they need, right? If they, nobody wants to have their parking spill out into a development outside or spill out somewhere else and have angry neighbors. If they know that to typically serve their population and the people that they are going to have as residents, they need X amount of parking, they typically will build that amount. And they will only build more if it's required. And so that's where it starts to get into discussions about how much is too much, how much is too little. And really the reason I want to create some flexibility is because it's going to depend on the population as well, because
Yeah.
it's so variable in terms of the types of populations that these developments might cater to, that the parking requirements could be drastically different for a development that is oriented towards families where you may have kids who are 16, 17 who have a car along with their parents who have cars and need to get to work, versus a development for maybe senior housing or senior residents that aren't going to drive as much. I think giving the city the ability to have an understanding of that, and maybe we're not going to be able to get that granular in terms of an objective requirement, but we can certainly take a look at what might be possible.
Well, and to Tim's point, I think what I'm saying is I don't want to require people to build more parking than is necessary. I think that there's this is a different use case than a standard residential
Yeah,
development. And so we need to treat it differently in that respect. And if we can right size the parking requirement to step housing instead of just copying and pasting the one from standard, whatever the residential use is or whatever the other use is in the neighborhood, I think that's a better outcome for everybody. Because as Juliana said, parking is really expensive to build, and the developers are going to build what they need. But I just don't want to force them to build more because that
yeah,
seems like an undue burden.
yep, I hear you. Okay. The other note that I added to the bottom of this that we wanted to make sure that everyone was aware is the city's going through a process of modifying requirements for indoor and outdoor temporary homeless shelters and cold weather low barrier shelters. It's separate but related because a lot of this has overlap with emergency housing. So we're working with Development Services and Debbie and team to make sure that whatever recommendations we make align with those as well. So that's just, again, something separate that I want to make sure the committee was aware of. So if any of that does end up changing our recommendations on emergency housing, then we'll make sure that you're aware of that too.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So here are a couple items. And again, I want to preface this by saying some of these are things that we've talked about in the past. And I know just generally from what we've heard from the committee that some of these are not things that are going to be recommended, but we wanted to put them forward anyways. It's just getting, again, with a small group, we're not going to be able to get this today, but getting final thoughts and even maybe a recommendation about whether to include or exclude some of these things as we go through. So these are items that other jurisdictions have as part of their codes. There are some requirements that, again, they are in some instances, Commerce, which released guidance, which again is very pro step housing, warrants against, while not saying that they are not allowed to cities are not allowed to have them. So just wanted to set that kind of expectation before we walk through them, because I know that we have talked about a few of these in the past, and they haven't been overly popular with the community. But also, I know that we haven't generally had our whole committee together, right? So it's tough to know where everyone sits, and so wanted to try and come to a consideration. But things like requiring a project narrative with an equity analysis, this would be something the goal would be to make sure that there wasn't an over concentration of transitional or permanent supportive housing developments in one place that overly impacts, in this case, an already predominantly racially disparaged area. You can go to UW's website and look at these different areas that have existing racial covenants and different areas that have these different components of each community in Western Washington, honestly. So it would be an equity analysis that we would have to set parameters for and look at different requirements. And I don't even know necessarily that it would be the requirement would be that you would do it. It does create, to the earlier point, a bit of subjectivity, because there is not necessarily an objective requirement to hit. I suppose we could try and establish one that says, oh, you're not overly disparaging this one community, but it becomes a little bit more of a subjective narrative that then gets entered in versus an objective requirement. So thoughts on a narrative with an equity analysis component? And we can circulate language from, there's I think that maybe the nearest jurisdictions like Linwood that has it in their code, to what the specific language says. That's helpful.
Is this done for any other sort of development, or is this just something that's
It's not required for any other development in Kenmore right now.
And to your knowledge, do other jurisdictions require it for anything other than stop?
Not that we've seen.
Okay.
So is this okay? I thought that I knew what this was, and then Nick, I'm sorry, you started explaining, and I realized that maybe my thoughts were off. So maybe explain this to me like I'm 5. I thought that maybe these were to protect us from all dumping, kind of like redlining, like dumping all of our step housing on like one part of Kenmore and saying we're gonna put all of our shelters right here, right? Or we're just gonna dump everything. And that having a project with an equity analysis would say, we recognize the broader community and we recognize the resources and we recognize, I don't know, blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah, the socioeconomic layout. And we are very thoughtfully doing this development here for these following reasons. Is it something else or
No,
is
I
it
know. I think you have it. I think you have
okay?
it right. Yeah. And yeah, it is like a equity throughout the community and basically trying to make sure that certain areas aren't targeted for step housing development based on specific characteristics, and there's not an over concentration in one area. But at the same time, you'll see at the bottom of this, we're not recommending that there are any siting and spacing requirements in terms of 500 or 1,000 feet, between each development or something like that. So, yeah, no, I think Julian, I think you generally have a good understanding of it.
So I think we run into a weird problem in Kenmore because of all of our services kind of being concentrated in the same cute little strip along
Yeah.
along the highway, right? That there's no way to provide proximity to transit, proximity to services, and not concentrate them all in the same area. So like, I mean, it'd be great to spread them throughout the city, but it would also be great to have like a walkable, transit-friendly north end of Kenmore, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I just don't see that. I
I'm
see this as a barrier that is like going to be problematic for the next 20 years potentially until like so many things have to change in order to get services throughout the city so that you could spread step throughout the city and to get transit throughout the city so you could spread step and people would still have access to mass transit that like I they're going to be concentrated. I just don't I I don't see another way if you want to be able to have people have access to services in transit.
I'm tripping over the same thing as Kat. Like I preach out against like redlining and inadvertently like clustering, you know, things badly all the time, but transit oriented development is so key for this type of housing and for connectivity with our low mobility and high need neighbors that I feel like if we are going to be building around our transit lines, it's going to be very clearly we are going to be building
Hmm.
around our transit lines, and it's going to be very likely that some neighborhoods, I don't
Yeah.
know. I mean, I would love there to be small little pockets of group homes tucked in some of these different residential spaces, of course. But I don't know. I also don't want equity to be like weaponized weird, and I don't know. I'm with Kat. This feels more like a weird barrier than a goal for us.
I mean, if council wants to send the whole zoning map to us to redo, we can fix it, but I
If
don't
I
think
suddenly could do a lot with like public transit and just be like rerouting bus
just
lanes, like
saying.
I mean, but I don't think I have that sort of power.
Right. Where's
Maybe
that
not
magic
within
wand
this,
when we need it?
maybe not within the capacity of this committee. Tim, I saw you come off mute. You wanna?
Oh, I mean, yeah, just a vote for you guys are absolutely correct. Based on the geographics of our city, almost don't have any choice but to not have like it's worded a specific narrative, and I don't know if we can get around it.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good understanding. Like I said, we'll circulate this around with a bit of a description for the rest of the group as well that wasn't able to provide their thoughts. But the rest of these all kind of fall along those same lines. They are narrative requirements that would get submitted at the same time that the application was submitted. Um, as far as we've seen, they are only requirements of step housing in these other jurisdictions where we've seen it, and they are not currently requirements of any other types of housing within Kenmore. So it's a description of the need for the project. So um, having a property owner go through and uh, write a description about what population this would serve, why this is an underserved population, why this development needs to exist. Um, again, we hesitated a little bit, just be fully honest, we hesitated because we don't make market rate housing, define a need for their housing. So it's a tough argument to say we're going to make step housing do it. But again, it's something that is being done in other jurisdictions. So we wanted to bring it forward as something for the committee to at least think about for a little bit. And similarly, along the lines of reasonably like investigated alternative sites, it goes kind of back to the clustering of did someone look and see are there other sites that are available for those types of housing? We don't make market rate do that, and
Yeah, I read that, and part of me felt like you had to defend why you wanted to build here, and it
essentially,
felt kind of, I don't know, there's something.
I think to the earlier point, it's more burden. I won't say overly burden. It's more burdensome than the requirements for just market rate housing.
Why
And
can't you
so,
just say we have an empty lot or this
yeah,
building is for sale and we're refabbing it? Like,
Or Kenmore needs to accommodate this many units and we have zero. So
yeah.
I
we're
feel like that's,
buying this land.
yeah.
It was for sale. We liked the price. Do you had to have tried like I mean, if you're doing everything else, I don't know, the the looking for the other investigated alternative sites felt very, that one left kind of a weird taste in my mouth.
Okay.
Um, but the need for the project, absolutely. The proposed security plan, absolutely. I think we talked about this in the other one. I do think that both city council and just generally we talked about this last meeting, just generally the community does care about parking and the impact of parking. I mean, I think Tim brought this up, like whether that's going to be less parking, whether that's going to be big parking, underground parking, that's something that's on people's minds. I think that even if we're very happy with the amount of parking, I think that a lot of people are curious, like, is this going to be a lot of like disabled older veterans in wheelchairs that don't need parking? Is this going to be like a group home for temporary teenagers that all have their own cars? Like, I think people are interested in that. Um, I think I don't know, I think there's some things that warrant some like narratives and pre-analysis for us to know, but I don't know, the equity analysis and the proving why you're turning down other options and you want this one, just I don't know, that lands different for me. So feel free to have other thoughts, guys.
Well, I will say typically projects do require a narrative that mostly just describes the project.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily have these components of saying why there's a need for the project and those types of things. But applications always do require a narrative that says, please give us a description of what you're proposing and walk through the design aesthetic of it or anything like that. So
Mhm,
that is
mhm.
an existing requirement. It's just some of these more maybe nuanced components don't exist. So I think what we will do, especially because we have a smaller group, is we will circulate this out to the group and we'll kind of set a deadline of like, hey, please provide your feedback by this time. And that allows people to have a little more time to think about it and also allows us to get the feedback from the entire group. And then we'll be able to pull that together and have that kind of influence the final determination that we have in terms of our recommendation to you all in terms of your recommendation to council. So a couple of things again, just wanted to note that we considered but were not recommended siting and spacing requirements. Some jurisdictions have them. You technically can have them, but Commerce recommends you don't. And well, in order to have them, you would have to provide an analysis. The city would have to perform an analysis that said, if you had 1,000 foot, let's say 1,000 feet, because that's a common one, 1,000 foot spacing requirement, you have to prove that there are enough sites, viable sites in your jurisdiction that you could have that requirement in place and still meet your housing goals for these different types. So it's an additional analysis, and I don't know how that analysis would fare. So we did not include that in there, and then we also did not again require a good neighbor agreement. So okay, so we will make sure we get those out and get the feedback. We also did want to talk a little bit because the next time we actually meet or see each other will be the open house, and so that is next month. Hopefully everyone has that on their calendar, September 17th. The goal for this committee is to have as many people as possible attend in person. We are going to have these separate stations set up essentially.
Do we have a time for that? I'm
Thank you.
sorry.
Yes,
It's not on
please.
my calendar.
Oh yeah,
I'm
sorry.
catching up now.
Debbie, do you remember the time? I think
I want to say it was 6 to 8.
Okay,
we will confirm that.
thank you.
I do think that was it. It's in the kind of evening times. So goal is to attend. Maybe it's easier to lay out the stations first and then talk about kind of responsibilities. The first station is just an intro. It's got a lot of the introductory information. We are really approaching this from the standpoint of folks may not have all the background, likely do not have all the background that the committee has on step housing. They haven't spent the last 5-6 weeks talking about it, or sorry, 5-6 months talking about it. And maybe didn't get the chance to watch the panel discussion, all those different types of things. So we start from a basis of there's a little bit of understanding and needing to go on just to set a baseline that everyone can start from the same spot. So that's kind of the first overview of step housing and state requirements. We're going to talk a little bit about the committee's role and responsibilities and ultimately what recommendations are going to be made to council and how that process works. We will talk about some of the things that ultimately get put forward as recommendations for changes. So we will talk about the good neighbor agreement. We'll talk about the owner operator agreement. We'll talk about the code edits. One thing we didn't talk about, because it's not really changing, is the process requirements within the code. That stays as the process requirements that are required for any the multifamily equivalent within that zone. So, or single family if it is a single unit or something like that. So so that we didn't talk about that there in our presentation, but that basically stays as that same type 1 process. And then we will ask at the end in the 4th station for feedback. And the question we thought about asking everyone was, what should the STEP committee consider in their recommendation to council? We felt that that wasn't overly leading one way or another. It allowed people to give the responses that they would like to give, and kept it kind of broad enough to be able to capture a response that was directly tied to the deliverable that the committee needs to prepare. And so certainly welcome workshopping that question, but essentially what we envisioned was sort of, many of you have done them in the past, right? Question at the top, sticky note responses in there, and then we can analyze those responses and ultimately get a summary, and the committee can review that at the next meeting, because we do have our last meeting following the month following that workshop. So we can provide a summary report of what we heard from the meeting to you all as a committee ahead of that meeting, and then we can discuss there and see if that changes any of the recommendations.
What will our role as committee members be at this open house?
Yep. So we will have somebody, whether it's city staff or our team, at each of the stations. So your role really is to be there, talk to folks if they have questions. We'll have different name tags that identify you as committee members versus us as staff, or staff or consultant. And then if someone comes up to you and asks you, hey, what was this committee about? What did you all work on? Feel free to provide your insight into the process, into what was discussed, and kind of just walk through the overall, answering questions. If someone has more technical questions and you want to direct them to any of us, feel free to direct them to myself or to staff. I'll be there. We'll have a couple other people there as well that can answer questions. So yeah, we don't have you stationed at any particular spot. You're really floating around answering questions and just kind of engaging with folks as members of the committee.
All right.
Okay.
I have one additional thought.
Yeah.
Separate from the open house. This all looks great, Nick. I was going to send this an email and I just haven't. So last meeting we talked a lot about notice and public notice. And I know sometimes it was brought up that sometimes people's big concern is they didn't feel like I know that public notice is a point of big feelings in our community. And so one thing that I was thinking of, and I'm sorry for Debbie and city staff because I'm asking you to do things. I know that often, because I'm close to downtown, like I get, mail that tells me that there's public notice. I was also thinking that, okay, I'm rambling. I'm sorry. I know that also sometimes people are like, well, if you want to know what's going on in the city, like subscribe to the emails or subscribe to like the top 4. I was wondering, could we make an email list that is just for housing development, not for city council meetings, not for anything else, but just for when there's just for housing. And I want to say not just step housing, but any of the big, and I don't know what the cutoff would be for if it's like more than 6 people. And so when the neighbors are like, I didn't know that those condos were being built, or I didn't know that empty lot, or why didn't anybody tell me? It's easy to say, well, if you get on that email list, you will know. Is that an option? Could someone do that? Is that impossible work?
May I default to Debbie a little bit?
I know, I'm so
on
sorry.
Process of whether
I think it's one of those things. We want to get as much notice as we can. The code does prescribe when noticing to the public for a specific development is required.
Yes. And I do get those, and thank you.
So, but I mean, that
So
is
many
not,
come to my house.
yeah, that is not for all. So for example, for a type 1 process, there's not a requirement that, you're building a house that you have to let all your neighbors know that you're building. So again, it would be okay. I think we would run into the same issue is that it doesn't matter what we do or what happens. Someone's going to say, I didn't know that. Who knew? I had no idea. No matter how many signs go on the site, or if there is a public notice requirement, if there's a newsletter or whatever, somebody will not know. So I would say with the channels that we have and the website about housing, we can sort of improve that. I
Okay.
know on development services, they have on their webpage for development services, when there are larger projects, they have links on there and are very specific.
Okay.
So I'm with you that I love to make sure that everybody gets a notice or has the ability to get on a list. But again, you're creating another list to manage.
I know.
So I'm with you on the need for notice. I'm a little hesitant about creating another process or another list, especially if it's optional. Because what that does then is you can say, well, I would have said something, but I wasn't on the list. So there's pros and cons, but we can do the best that we can. I would say that, if it is a larger development like a step housing, that some of these things that we have in there regarding community engagement and the template for community engagement will help for that type of housing.
Yeah. I just
So
also think about how one thing that I totally hear you. And as I'm saying this out loud, I was like, oh, I also don't want to be doing so many parallel things that we,
mhm,
dilute the good things.
right.
I also, anytime that we can make what we're doing for step housing be similar announcements or the same
Yeah.
as, like if we're making 100 units of step housing, part of me, I do want that to feel as, yes, there are some specialty and vulnerabilities and things that extra supports to be considered with that. And some things also, as a neighbor, I might not care if it's 100 units of, disabled veterans or if it's 100 units of college student partiers. Some information I care about the same way either way. Kind of like Tim said, like, are they going to be parking on my lawn? What is the noise going to be? What is my view impact going to be? Like some things I just care about because they're my neighbor, not because who lives there. Maybe I do care about who lives there, but maybe that's a secondary concern. And so part of me was just thinking like, oh, how can we also not make step housing notices? And I know that a lot of them are going to be the same, but I don't know, like the development websites or I don't know, the requirements for the notice be the same. I don't know. I'm tripping over myself, Debbie, but
No, I'm with you. I think we're all on the same page, is that
yeah,
we're trying to ensure that for the most part, step housing is looked at in terms of the process and the noticing requirements in the same way that any other type of housing is,
yeah.
regardless of size.
Yeah.
And, like I think sometimes sometimes there are really large buildings that have nothing to do with being low income that all of us look at, or some of us look at, and we're like, what's going on there?
Mhm.
So, I don't think that all of our questions or desire for like information, I don't think that's uniquely a step,
No,
that's not a uniquely a step concern.
I
So,
mean, I think anytime anything is built, people are like, what is changing? Tell me what is changing.
yeah.
What does that mean? And again, it's going to be, everybody's going to have a different opinion about when something gets built. They'll either like it, love it, hate it, don't want it. I mean, you can't anticipate that. And I don't think you could basically say whether it's size based. I think it's more than just the size of the project that get people all
Mhm.
wound up. And it's really hard to anticipate what that would be. It's also then really hard to anticipate, are those concerns reasonable? So this is something that we run into all the time when there's a project and you get comments in, and you have to kind of assess then, what are the comments really concerned about? Are there genuine impacts of a project that need to be mitigated? Sometimes it's more couched in they don't like the project, and it's like, oh, okay. Sometimes people articulate what their concerns are, and then you kind of assess then, is there some concern there, whether it's noise or parking or whatever it might be. So I think we would look at the noticing, we would look at public comments in the same way that we do for any other kind of development.
And Debbie, just real quick, I don't think with the code a decent amount at this point, I don't think there's a requirement for a public meeting, but I know we've talked in the past about, and again, not just for staff housing, but for all developments, that
Right.
people have a recommendation early on that applicants find some way to provide information on the project or engage the community. I know a lot of them do create materials that city could share. So, right, it's not a code change to make it a requirement or anything, but I think in terms of just city processes for maybe when somebody comes in with a pre-app or something like that, to provide feedback to say, hey, we think it'd be great if you could provide information through a community meeting. It's just one more thing to Juliana's point of like being able to point to, well, you may not have, gotten this notice, but we also did this. We also had, the developer also held a community meeting. Like there are these different things that have happened, and just all in the attempt to get be as transparent as possible and get as much information out as possible. And again, regardless of its step or not, I think it's something that the city can consider.
If the step housing page is going to stay up as part of the city website, would it be possible to just like create, notices of just like add a line, say we received an application to put a step housing development of this size in this 100 block of this street or something like that?
These are our current step projects.
Yeah, or the potential step projects. These are the ones permitted. These are the ones undergoing review.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Then people can just look.
Yeah.
Even just make the website.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
then it's like there's an existing page. It's one line of text or two lines of text every time there's an application in, and so you might be updating it twice a year.
Well, and like David, like you mentioned, that those projects are probably already going to be listed on the development services page as well. But having them be on the step page just gets them
Yeah.
gets somebody a cleaner line to be able to see it. So
Yeah,
Okay.
that seems a great idea. Yeah.
Less burdensome, a little bit.
I think it gets to the same thing. Yeah, it's just trying to a good way for people to find information.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Than's for entertaining
Of
my
course.
thoughts, Debbie. I know you have a lot more decades of dealing with this than
No.
I do.
No, public notice is always a challenge, but I will do what we can to, get as most people noticed for whatever kind of project. And thanks, Caitlin. I like that idea for the website.
Absolutely.
So next steps, we're preparing the materials for that open house. We're going to provide them to the city to review. We can certainly provide the draft materials. It's going to be all just I don't want to say regurgitation, but it's going to be the same information that you've seen to this point, just organized on boards and explained out. But it would be good to get the committee's feedback in case something that we put on a board is unclear or could be made clear by changing in wording or something like that. So once the city reviews, we can get those draft boards out before they get printed and brought to the workshop as well. And then we do have an October meeting, I believe, Debbie, following the workshop to all just get our last considerations in, take in the feedback from the community. Like I said, we'll put the summary together from the workshop so that the first time you're seeing it is not when we meet, it'll be ahead of time. And then really, I think at that meeting, we need to come together and say we all agree on the recommendations that are going to be brought forward to council, because I believe they're going to be brought forward to council. The goal right now is later in October, if that's still the timeline, Debbie.
Yeah, I think we were sort of targeting after the open house I think we were looking at October 8th as a potential date to give enough time to consolidate comments and see if those, resulted in any suggested changes to what is being proposed. So I think it's October 8th, which then means that, we need then time to put a packet together for the council. So that would probably be later in October.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, any last questions or comments or anything? We'll get the materials that we discussed today out to the larger group to get feedback from everyone. And then, again, we'll send the materials out for the open house as well. So you have all those. But any questions, comments? Okay. Well,
Okay,
thank
at
you
this
all.
point, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
Really appreciate it. Have a great night.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye.